So when we're dealing with these symbolic logic operations, certain ones, certain connections, certain things take precedence over others, which we can list in order from least to greatest in terms of importance as, first, negations being the least, then conjunctions and disjunctions where they're roughly equivalent, sort of in the way that plus and minus are roughly equivalent with the order of operations. Then we have conditionals, and then finally the most important is the biconditional, where technically outside of that you have parentheses that get trumped over everything else. Those always get grouped first. But if we want to see some quick examples of how this works, if we look at statements that we have given here, then for something like P implies Q and not R, then we have that the P implies Q is the most important, then the conjunction, Q and not R is next with the not R sort of by itself, where you could re-clarify the meaning there if you wanted to group that disjunction by itself after the implication, where the conditional is the most important part. Then next, if we have P and Q implies not R, then in that case, again, the implication is the most important, but to keep the Q and the P together like they're supposed to be, you could group those as well with a parenthesis, but the most important thing that happens there is that conditional part of the statement. Then if we have a biconditional followed by an implication, a biconditional followed by a conditional, the biconditional takes precedence. We could group the conditional to keep it on its own, but the biconditional is ultimately what determines what happens there. Even if we have that second, still we get controlled by the biconditional. And then if we get even more complicated with four things, P and not Q implies R or S. The implication there, the conditional, is what's most important, but we might want to group the conjunction and the disjunction separately because those might be important statements in and of themselves. Whereas if we have something silly like P and Q or R, the meaning is very ambiguous. Much in the same way as throwing a division right next to a multiplication, we can't tell which one of those is going to be the best or which is the most important. So you'd actually really want to have some parentheses around one pair of those things so you know which one has to be handled first and which one is the ultimate determination of what happens. But let's get an example here for how these ideas come together in terms of what sort of statements we form when dealing with the dominance of conditionals. So for the simple statements we have below, P is it feels like I never go backwards, Q is every time part of me says go ahead, and R is I got my hopes up again. We want to translate the following statements into symbols, where we have it feels like I sometimes go backwards if and only if every part of me says go ahead and I got my hopes up again, along with it feels like I sometimes go backwards if and only if every part of me says go ahead and I got my hopes up again. Like I said, making biconditionals work with music, it's a little silly. We like a little bit less surety in our lyrics than this, but it's still a fun place to end for this section. So with that first one, what we want to recall is that the opposite of never is something more like sometimes. The opposite of no examples is some examples. And since we have a biconditional that's not separated by a comma, we would have something with that first one in the vein of not P, if and only if the conjunction Q and R. Because we have that if and only if there in the middle, which is kind of sneaky to read out of a sentence because it's almost always thrown in the middle there, followed by the two statements read pretty much directly. Then for our second case, we have a comma thrown in there, and that comma does make a difference in terms of grouping. Remember, parentheses get read essentially as commas to show that one thing is being grouped. So what we would have there is more like not P, if and only if Q, and then on top of that, and R at the end, where that might not seem like a very big difference, but it does adjust the veracity ultimately of that statement. It adjusts when that may or may not be true in terms of what things get brought together, what things we have to prioritize first. And in order to really understand that, we may want a bit more notation. I know notation scares people, but for this, we can and will see how it could be useful in terms of things called truth tables to help us present and understand the cases in which our statements, our compound statements in particular, are and are not true. That's what we're going to get to in section 3.3.